Hey everyone, Matteo here. Join me today as I check out the Kemimoto Battery Isolator. I'm installing this on my Pioneer 1005. It's a 2018 model. Nonetheless, this kit is universal in nature. It will give you the general components for installing an isolated second battery on your vehicle. This video was tailored specifically to the Pioneer 1005, but a lot of these concepts are vehicle, make, model independent and agnostic, so you can certainly learn a thing or two if you stick around and watch me install this thing. So what is an isolator? Basically what an isolator is just an electronic switch that allows you to have a second battery in your vehicle that is dedicated to a specific use. Usually in the side-by-side world, that use is aftermarket accessories, things like a winch, auxiliary lighting, sound bars, essentially any of these aftermarket components that you want to run independent of your main charging system. What the isolator's job is basically a switch, and it's a switch between your main battery, which is tied into your vehicle's charging system, and your new battery. And when you shut your vehicle off, that switch will open, keeping your auxiliary battery free of your main battery, and you can run your accessories with your vehicle off to your heart's content. You don't have to worry about that battery draining and your battery's ability to have enough charge to start the vehicle, because your main battery is sitting there disconnected and waiting to start your vehicle. And then when you start the vehicle, the isolator's job is to close and connect your auxiliary battery to your main battery, your vehicle's charging system, and get it charged up again so that the cycle can continue until the batteries wear out and you have to buy new ones. Kemimoto's isolator is nice because it includes a manual override or an emergency start switch. So basically they give you a wire where we can tie a momentary switch into position, and if we ever need to, we can manually connect the isolator and basically connect our auxiliary battery to our charging system with the vehicle off, and that will allow the vehicle to start. There's a lot of great things in this kit. I'm excited to check it out and get it installed on my vehicle. A side note, if you are going to take the plunge with adding a second battery, there's some additional components that you'll want to consider purchasing. Going over Kemimoto's kit here, basically what they're going to give us is the isolator itself, a dual voltage voltmeter that will enable us to monitor both our primary and auxiliary batteries, and they do give us some miscellaneous hardware connections and whatnot. There's some thick gauge wire for connecting the battery to the new isolator unit, but that is not the whole picture. Some additional things you'll want to consider if you're doing an installation like this. It would behoove you to have some terminals and possibly some heat shrink available. There's going to be some custom wire connections, things like that, and the Kemimoto kit does not include every single piece of terminal hardware that you may or may not encounter in your installation. Another thing that I picked up for this installation is an aftermarket fuse panel. That fuse panel allows me to easily add fused protection to auxiliary circuits. It gives me extensibility in that any accessory I want to add in the future has become a snap to install. I connect it to the fuse panel. It includes a ground bus inside that same fuse block, so I've got an easy ground source now, and I can willy-nilly, lickety-split connect additional auxiliary things to my new battery very easily. If you're going to go through the trouble of having a second battery, I would certainly recommend adding an aftermarket fuse panel to take full advantage of all your labor. Now, why would you want to add a second battery? I already kind of explained the whole process of what an isolator does, how it fits in with a main battery and an auxiliary battery. The nice thing with an auxiliary battery is you'll have a dedicated battery for your accessories. Really, what I want to have this battery for, two reasons. I want to be able to use my sound bar when the vehicle's off. It's nice to be able to park my side-by-side somewhere, grill some food, go hang out in the woods, and listen to tunes. buttons, so I won't have to worry about keeping my vehicle in the key on position or hardwiring my soundbar to my main battery and potentially drawing that battery down after a long, hard day of rocking out in the woods and having my vehicle not start. I don't have to worry about that now. Another thing that is great about this is that you have got a second battery with those additional amps available for things like a winch. So if I'm using my winch, I've got the vehicle running, there is enough current to allow that winch to operate without drawing down my main battery and putting a tremendous burden on my charging system. I have used my winch before for recovery purposes, and I know when I'm winching out of something extremely taxing that my charging system is hanging on for dear life. I've had the power steering light up. I've had the clutch not want to engage because the computer and all the reference voltages are so low that the vehicle doesn't want to operate properly. So there are some real concerns with running one battery as you start to add these high draw aftermarket accessories like a winch. Before long, you'll probably want to consider having a second battery. And really, for the price of a second battery, an isolator, and a fuse panel, you're looking at a couple $100. You'll be able to really take advantage of that as you grow with your side-by-side and customize it to your needs. So let's get to it. I'm going to stop running my mouth. Let's get this thing installed. Come on. I am going to break this installation into 3 distinct parts. The first of which is installing my second battery. Honda, right from the factory, has a recess under the front of the vehicle for a second battery, so we're already at a major advantage there. We're going to get the battery installed. The second phase of the installation is going to be actually installing the Kemimoto isolator and battery gauge. We will tackle that in step 2. And then in step 3, I'm going to actually install my aftermarket fuse block and connect some of my existing accessories, specifically my soundbar and my winch, to the auxiliary fuse box. And that auxiliary fuse box, of course, is going to be powered by the second battery we are adding. When you break it into sections, it's really not a big, daunting installation, and it is very straightforward. Before I put in my second battery, I took a step this morning to kind of lay everything out, envision where everything is going, not only as far as which wires go where and where I'm going to get my key on power. That is one thing we'll talk about. You'll need a source of key on power, and fortunately it's pretty easy to get to it. I will take you through that in a minute when we get there, but also kind of figuring out where I'm going to physically locate the different components on the machine. So obviously, our second battery is going to go into the factory provided recess location for it. In my particular case, I already have a contactor for my winch. It takes up a pretty good bit of real estate under the hood, so I'm a little bit limited where I would probably be inclined to install my isolator if this was not already installed on my vehicle. That being said, as I mentioned, I don't have a factory airbox anymore. I think I'm going to modify the airbox bracket to be the location from my battery isolator. Should be pretty straightforward. The relay I'm not too worried about. It needs to be somewhere you can access it if you had to service it or whatnot, but I'm thinking I'm going to zip tie it to the frame rail tucked away in the back and out of the way. I think having the relay in that location will allow me to get all the power connections and the ground connections I need without having to extend any wiring. And the relay itself goes into this socket. If I ever have to change it out, it's in a fairly accessible location. And my aftermarket fuse block, it's not terribly large. I am picturing putting it back here. My goal with this is I want to be able to easily pop this cover off in the event I've got to change a fuse out or connect anything new. And this aftermarket fuse block is great because it gives us easy connections for new and exciting circuits we want to add, any kind of accessories, we can just tie in right here. It comes with fuses. We can get the right fuse protection involved, and it also has a ground block. We've got a dedicated connection from our ground, our negative terminal on the battery, where we can tie in our accessories right here. We don't have to drill anything to the frame or add grounds arbitrarily. I have got my secondary battery all set. If you're buying a brand new battery, you may have to add your electrolyte to the battery. Carefully follow the manufacturer's directions for doing that. And I'm going to go ahead and plop our new battery into position. All right, there it is. It fits right in there. Now that I've got my new battery into position, I'm going to take my existing ground connection from Honda. Here again, this is located on the left side of the vehicle, so if you're looking at it from the front like I am right now, it's going to be on the right there. And Honda has a little body connector pin, and we'll carefully pry that up out of the way. I've got a little body pin tool, so let me scoop it out. There we go. You'll know you've got the right wire because it's taped up with some blue tape. At least circa 2018, this is how they were doing it. And we can get rid of the blue tape, we don't need it. Honda put this in the vehicle specifically to add an auxiliary battery. And I'm just peeling off all this blue tape so that I can expose our electrical connector. We got a fresh terminal in there we're going to use and connect right to our negative battery terminal. I need to come under some of my existing winch wires, and you'll want to make sure you're connecting it to the negative terminal. I like to have the rubber boots completely out of the way when I do these things, so there is a little piece of black electric tape on this wire that's holding the rubber boot into position, and I'm removing that at this time, and I'm hoping it'll let me slide my boot down. Alright, so removing that little piece of tape, I could get my boot nice and out of the way, and I'll reinstall it once I'm completely done with this battery and isolator installation. I'm going to take my Kemimoto supplied black negative wire. So I'm actually going to use this to connect to my auxiliary fuse block when I get that far. But for now, I'm going to connect both of these to my new battery's negative terminal. We're going to install the Kemimoto battery isolator and their relay that's going to power the voltage gauge, all that good stuff, right? I'm going to start with the relay. And no particular reason with that. I would say the most difficult aspect with installing the relay is going to be getting your key on 12 volt power. Now, I mentioned that it's not too hard to find that on the vehicle. In your factory fuse block, there's two little tabs on the left side looking at it from the front of the vehicle. Carefully squeeze those tabs, this fuse block will lift out. And if you look, you've got a 15 amp accessory fuse, and that wire feeding that is a white with a black stripe wire, and I used a vampire tap to key into that wire. I've got a red wire that comes out, and in not my proudest electrical achievement, I've got a wire nut that has been powering some accessories. I've got my radio tied to that. That is going to be my source, and you can key right into that with your vampire tap. You'll need to provide that particular part. So this is what a tap looks like, and it's pretty straightforward. You've got this opening inside. On one side, you're going to put your wire, you're tapping, let it rest in there. On the other side, you're going to just butt up the wire coming out that you're going to use as your connection to this wire. It does not go all the way through. There's a little block at the end where it will stop. Once those two wires are in place, you're going to carefully close it without moving it. You don't want to move any of the wires in there, and because this guillotine blade comes down, punctures the insulation on both wires, and provides a conductive connection for your new wire to your existing wire. This whole thing gets sandwiched together and crushed with some pliers, and they work pretty well when you install them properly. So that's what I did. And that white and black stripe wire will give you the power you need to activate the relay. Because I already have that connection ready to go, I'm going to connect my relay to that wire. If you decide to do anything with wire nuts, good for you. I would be certain to use some dielectric grease on the wires to keep any kind of moisture condensation out of there, prevent corrosion. So I've got a pair of wire strippers, and I'm going to use them to strip the wire on the Kemimoto relay harness. And I kind of pre-twist them. Here again, this is because I'm using wire nuts. There we go. The next connection we need to worry about is the green and black ground wire. So I decided all of my grounds today are going to be tied into my new fuse box, ground bar, ground bus, whatever you want to call it. And I'm doing this so that I can avoid cluttering my ground terminals, my negative terminals on my batteries with ground lugs. There's no reason to make a sloppy install. So with that in mind, I am going to terminate the relay, the black and green wire from our Kemimoto relay, with their supplied circular terminal. And this is going to crimp on like that. All right. I've got my crimpers, and I'm just gonna crimp it right on there. So this will be awaiting connection to our fuse box in the final step. The next connection, we're gonna prepare our black and white wire coming off the relay. Again, this is the lug that's got two. We're not gonna use the second one, that's optional, gives you an additional switch ground point for an accessory or something like that. You may not ever use it. So we are going to make sure that this connects to our gauge, the negative terminal on our battery gauge. So in order to connect to that Kemimoto with the supplied parts, they give us a terminal we can use for that. Here again, it is a crimp on connection. We'll use our wire crimpers, which are a must for this installation. There we have it. We'll be able to connect that to our battery gauge shortly once we get that installed under the dash. So at this point, we really just have to wait on hooking up these connections and we'll be good to go. In the meantime, I'm going to use one of the zip ties Kemimoto gave us to kind of secure this to the frame. And I'm zip tying to the connector itself. We've got our relay installed. We've got a connection for our gauge, which we will get to in a minute. We've got our switch to positive right here. And then we're going to have our negative on the ground bus, which we will get to in a second as well. So Kemimoto gives us some very small gauge wire. It's got a green and a gray wire within a white sheath. You can see I've already started to prepare these wires. On this end, I've got them split out because they're going to go to different points. The green wire is going to be our reference voltage for our main battery. The gray one's going to be our reference, that means positive voltage, for our auxiliary battery. And these are going to connect directly to our battery gauge so that we can monitor the voltage from each of our batteries. The other end, naturally, is going to connect to our gauge, our battery gauge. So on this end, we don't need to expose too much of the sheathing because these will be living rather close to one another. In any event, for both of these sides, I kind of just tried to carefully remove the sheathing. Kind of using some wire strippers to help kick things off. It could be a little challenging doing that. Sometimes I've had better luck with a razor knife or something. That didn't work out too poorly. And because these are going to be connected to the positive side of the battery, we don't want any sparks. We don't want any arcing. So you must be careful making these connections. Kemimoto gives us our blade terminals for these, so we'll get those installed. Yeah, it's good. All right. Okay, excellent. We're going to route this to our gauge, which we are fixing to get installed here in just a minute. Now on this end, I don't see any connections, or terminals I should say, that came with our Kemimoto kit. So that's why I went ahead and made sure I had ample wire connectors and terminal butt crimps, all that stuff. I bought a kit on Amazon. The important thing to take away from this is I'm going to have those terminal connections on hand so that I can easily put the right type of connector on the end of the wire and have it installed properly. Our green one's going to end up going over to the positive side of the battery. I'm trying to avoid directly connecting anything to the batteries, so what I think I'm going to do is I will end up tapping into my wire nut there for my main battery, and then I will tap into my fuse block for the other battery. I don't anticipate any issues with that working. This doesn't get power till the key is on anyway, so that is my plan. I'm going to go ahead and get some ring terminal on my gray wire for the auxiliary battery, and then this one's going to get it right off the teat here at the wire nut. I'm going to have to upgrade that wire nut to a red one. I've got kind of a residential wiring background, and that's why I went with the wire nut, but I really don't like using them in automotive and marine applications like this. Since I already went down that path, I'm gonna stay down it. Alternatives to having this unsightly wire nut would be putting a ring terminal on here and getting it right off your positive. You could get the positive connection off your solenoid as well if you didn't want to tie up to the battery, which I could conceivably do. There are other ways than just tying it directly to your positive, but I guess the most easiest thing to do would be to connect it to your positive. It's just going to be another connection you have when it's time to change your batteries, and I'm trying to limit those. And you can see I'm going to have to split this sheathing a little bit more, and I'm just kind of roughly separating it out to kind of give me the space I'll need. And we can trim this up. So generally speaking, we'll have something like this. I can route it a little bit more neatly. Go ahead and put a ring terminal on it. This is a suitable type of connection. I've got a little sloppy with the wire there. I've got some heat shrink, and I'm going to use that to kind of make a repair. A little heat goes a long way with that stuff. And that way I've got my insulation repaired. Conversely, if you don't have heat shrink, you can always use some wire tape. I'm gonna go ahead and get the battery gauge installed now. Honda gives us our glorious, excessively large warning plate here, and I am not recommending, out of the sake of ethics, anybody remove this. There's very important safety information here. I love my vehicle so much that I have committed this to memory, and I don't need it. So I've decided that I'm going to use this space to mount not only my auxiliary switch, but my battery voltage gauge. And this is a great spot to easily access the wires we just installed on the front. You'll be able to route them nice and neatly to this area with minimal fuss. So what I'm doing now is I'm gonna go ahead and just drill the rivets out so that I can remove this plate. I'm guessing there's bare plastic under this plate. I've got an 1/8 inch drill bit. We'll see if that gets us through the rivets. You don't have to do this. And once again, I don't recommend you making any changes to your vehicle you feel are unsafe. That being said, alternative places to mount that gauge include up here next to behind your paddle shifter. But honestly, looking at the vehicle and the amount of space that's going on and visibility, if you want to see that gauge, this is really hard to beat. So I'm going to carefully pry that plate off, and if you decide to put it here, it goes without saying, you do so at your own risk. It looks like there's some adhesive that Honda's got. A heat gun or a hairdryer might even help too. Get that adhesive loose. You really need to work your prying device up in there. Good job, Honda. Did not need those rivets. All right, so now I've got ample real estate to put this voltage gauge on. Whenever I'm cutting holes in dashboards or things of that nature, I really like to have some certainty as to where things are going. Make sure I'm not going to be interfering with anything. I've got some shift cables here, and it looks like the bracket kind of goes in this general area, possibly underneath this. So I'm going to stay more to this side, I think. I'm going to be using a hole saw to cut through this plastic, and I'm using looks like 1.25 inches. Will get us where we need to be. So I'm going to put this like right about there. Okay. Making a commitment. There it is. We did not damage anything behind there. That went smoothly. So I got a 5/8 paddle bit, and it looks like it will be sufficient for our switch. There we go. We're going to get our wires run through this hole and connected. We've got our two positives, and then this gold blade is our negative. So we will want to make sure we have the appropriate wires. I'm going to take the nut for this voltage gauge with me. It's a lock nut, and I'm going to run it onto the wire terminals. So the wires are going through the nut, so we can tighten it all down. And we got to find our hole. There we go. I think we're through there. So if we've done everything properly, we're going to have our ground wire waiting for us. Remember, our green is for our main battery. So I'm going to connect that. Our gray is for our auxiliary battery. Goes right below it. Ooh, that's tight. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get these on at the same time. Let's see. There we go. And there's our ground. So those blue blade connectors, it's a tight fit, but they all do fit together comfortably, and I don't think we'll have to worry too much about that, any of those wires coming off. So now what I need to do is, working from under the hood, I'm going to get that lock nut tightened up so that this is nice and secure. So at this point, you're going to just kind of have to feel your way around in here. But that's not too bad. I can feel it's going on. So just make sure you're not cross-threading. The nut should kind of thread on easily. And voila! That's that. And there we have it. So at this point in time, I've come to a completely optional step, and that is connecting the switch for the emergency start function of the Kemimoto Isolator switch. And essentially what I'm going to do is, on our actual isolator unit, which we have not got to installing yet, there is a connection for a yellow wire, and that yellow wire, when connected to ground by means of a switch, will tell the isolator to connect the auxiliary battery to the vehicle's starting system. And in a worst case scenario where your main battery was too discharged or failing to start the vehicle, you've got a backup. That's a pretty big feature of having a second battery. I think if you are going to go through this amount of work to installing a second battery and you don't have that functionality, you're really not getting your effort's worth. So the Kemimoto kit does not come with this switch. I'm using a momentary. Momentary means you push it, and when you let go, it goes back to not being pressed. I've got a link for this switch. I got it off Amazon as well. This is a marine grade switch that will give us the means to toggle batteries for starting purposes. I've got some extra wire. This was not supplied with Kemimoto's kit, so you will need suitable lengths of appropriate gauge wire. And once again, I'm using the terminals from my own supply to prepare these connections. These little ring connectors will work with the switch I have. I'll just crimp them on. And all this does, there's nothing magical really going on here. It's when that switch from the isolator gets a path to ground, it tells it to toggle batteries. So pretty straightforward. The switch I'm using just uses some Phillips screws to actually connect the wires. I'm getting the wires made up before I fish the switch through the dash, because I cannot easily access these terminals once the switch is installed. Now you can carefully bend these connectors if you'd like, just to kind of give it a smaller footprint. And I've got some of this wire loom, and I'll make a length of it just to kind of keep these wires together. Here again, this kind of stuff's optional, but I find whenever I do sort of a wiring project on a vehicle, I like to protect the wires and clean things up as much as I can, despite my wire nut job in there. And this is just going to keep everything kind of sorted. On this end, we're going to connect this to our ground bus on our fuse box when we get that far. And then this end is going to connect to the isolator. I will make these connections up after I install the switch. All right, I'm going to work from the other side. Just carefully get my nut started. I'm trying not to push the switch back through the dash. You could tighten that up with a wrench. I'm pretty comfortable with how tight I got it with my fingers. And because it is a marine switch, it's got this nice rubber, water resistant topper. And there we go. That's going to be my emergency cutover switch. Ladies and gentlemen, I have decided to install my isolator where my factory airbox, the little standoff was for that. There's two pins I used, little body push pins, disconnected those and it came right out. Now I do know that if you are using the factory airbox, this location will not be suitable for you. You could mount it over here if you don't have a winch. There are different options. I think the point though is the easier this isolator is to get to, the better. You ever need to access any of these connections, they do go to your batteries. You don't want it too far from this general area. So use your best judgment when you are installing it. The first thing I'm going to do is prepare these two smaller gauge wires. These are hardwired to the isolator unit itself. We need to put some terminals on them. So on the black wire, I've got a ring connector. I supplied this. The Kemimoto kit only comes with one ring connector, of which I used for my relay. And this black wire will go to a ground source. Kemimoto recommends connecting it directly to the frame somewhere for your ground. If you are installing an aftermarket panel like I am, chances are you're going to have a ground bus. You can also install your own dedicated ground bus. Really shouldn't make a difference as long as it has a solid source of ground. And here again, as a best practice, I would say try to avoid the habit of connecting things directly to either of your batteries. From a maintenance standpoint and from a cleanliness standpoint, that's really not how we should be doing it. If you're going as far as installing an aftermarket fuse panel, you might as well just take advantage of that. There is no reason at this point to be connecting things directly to batteries. I've got a butt connector that I've supplied for the yellow wire. This yellow wire is for our emergency start function. And essentially, the emergency start function will allow the isolator circuit to close, connecting both batteries when the vehicle is off. It's a manual override. So if your primary battery has lost its charge or is in poor health, then you can connect to a presumable healthy battery so you can get your vehicle started. It's a nice peace of mind. So we've got these joined. Now my black connection for ground, I'm going to connect it directly to my ground bus. You've got your fuse protection all sorted out, you've got your ground all sorted out, and we've got a dedicated battery now where we don't have to worry about putting too much strain on our main battery and whatnot. So this is a very nice feature to have. So now, important step, we got to pay attention to some detail. We are going to be connecting our two positive legs for our battery. The terminal with our red mark is going to be our primary battery. If you look on the circuit board, it even says start battery. So we want to route that wire to there. And I would take extra care to make sure you're not pinching any of the yellow or black wires coming out of this unit. And also make sure you are orienting the terminal so that the flat part is hugging the circuit board. Here again, making sure the yellow and black wires are not going to interfere or get pinched as I tighten things up. Here again, I want to just make sure this yellow wire is out of my way. And I'm going to go ahead and take my auxiliary battery and connect it to the silver post, like so. I'm making sure the terminal sits flush with the post. I'm making sure my spare wires, the yellow and black wires, are out of my way. You want a good connection, but there really is no need to crank them down and risk damaging the isolator. And that's why I'm using a stubby, so I don't go nuts. Just make sure everything's nice and comfortably routed. And we'll get our back in place. So I'm not using the screws supplied by Kemimoto for actually mounting my isolator. And the reason for that is I made a little metal plate, and the screws they provide are ideal for screwing directly into plastic, but for metal, I would say they are not the correct fastener. So if you're mounting this directly to some plastic on your machine, you should have no problem using their screws, but depending on your particular installation, you may need to modify things slightly. Okay, so at this point, I want to connect the batteries, their positive leads, to our isolator. To be extra safe, I'm going to disconnect my negative terminal. So the battery in my Pioneer is a flathead. You could also, looks like 10 millimeter it if you wanted. And you'll notice you got a side that sits flat, so make sure you put the flat side down. And I'm going to place a small flathead screwdriver under the square nut just to kind of hold it up, because as I add these different terminals onto the battery, the amount of threads available on the bolt becomes limited, and it'll be hard to catch that nut to get things retightened. Got my second lead for my auxiliary battery, and same thing, might be helpful to get a screwdriver under that square nut before you take it off. On my new battery, I've got Phillips head connectors. All right. So at this point, our isolator is connected to both batteries. We've got some connections we are waiting to tie to our ground. If you see this loose wire, it goes to my sound bar. I'm going to put a ring connector on that so that I can tap into my fuse block. And I'm also going to connect my winch to the auxiliary battery as well. I'm also going to make a suitable wire for connecting the auxiliary battery to the positive end of this fuse block to power everything here. I have got my aftermarket fuse block. I'm going to go ahead and get mounted, and I'm going to actually start to connect all these systems together so that we can take full advantage of our new battery here. It's going to be great. So I'm just going to start by trying to loosen up my connections on the fuse block. So those are loose. And I want to mount this in a way that makes sense. I've got a lot of the negative connections coming out here. I've got my positive side of the auxiliary battery towards camera left. So I'm going to kind of rock and roll with that. Before I start hooking anything up, I need to secure this to the vehicle somehow. And I'm going to make sure I've got room to access the battery. Due to the limited working space, I decided to go the Gorilla Tape, double-sided tape route. I've had pretty good luck with this tape. You'll just want to make sure everything's nice and clean. Okay, so it's time to start connecting things to our ground. I want to make sure everything's nice and snug. This is going to be from the auxiliary battery to the fuse block. This is going to supply our 12 volts to our auxiliary. I'm going to get that tight. I want to finish up connecting all of my wires to the isolator. We've got the dedicated ground from the isolator itself. I'm going to do the same thing. This is the one for our emergency battery switch. We've got our black and green wire from our relay from the Kemimoto kit. We're going to make sure that gets to ground. I want to take my winch battery, my winch power lead, which is right here. This is connected to the positive of your battery. Make sure your negatives on your batteries are disconnected. So this is the positive lead for my winch. We will now have a winch that is not draining the main battery when utilized. You don't know the advantages of that. If you ever need to use your winch, it draws a lot of current, and you're so much current that your battery could actually momentarily go low in voltage, and your vehicle will behave strangely. I've had it happen. So I am looking forward to that no longer being an issue. I'm going to just get my little screwdriver in there to help me keep that square nut in place, and I'm going to connect these 2 additional wires to the positive side of this battery very carefully. So I just kind of had to support that square nut with my finger so that it got up there with the extra height of all those lugs. This is the negative for the winch. We'll go ahead and reconnect the negative side to this battery. There we go. I think I've got everything connected as far as the Kemimoto stuff. I need to make this wire a little bit longer, and we're going to make it our first auxiliary circuit. This is, like I said, to my soundbar. So a little butt connector and a ring connector later. Now, if I have done this properly, my fuse block should be hot right now. And soundbar, I don't know what kind of fuse. I'll put a 10 amp fuse on it. So testing this out is going to be pretty straightforward. Basically, I'm just going to start the vehicle. As soon as the charging system kicks in, the isolator should see positive voltage from our main battery, which will be enough to exceed the 13.3 volt cut-in threshold and basically close the switch. When that switch closes, these 2 batteries are now tied to the vehicle's charging system, and our auxiliary battery should begin to charge in addition to our main battery. That's great. And we can confirm that 2 ways. There's going to be a red light on our isolator, and that should light up. That means the isolator is engaged, the switch is closed. You should also confirm on your voltage gauge that both your batteries are above 12 volts. Your 2 batteries should be reading somewhere in the range of 13.3 on the lower end and 14, and that number is going to fluctuate as the vehicle operates. The charging system voltage varies based on RPM and whatnot, but somewhere in that range. And if you see both batteries in that condition, you're in good shape. One of the nice things about the Kemimoto Isolator is that they give you the built-in ability to manually engage your isolator when the vehicle is off. And they call this the emergency start function. Basically, all that's going to do is allow you to close the isolator with the push of a button and allow you to connect the auxiliary battery to the primary battery, which should enable you to start your vehicle in the event your primary battery fails. And the operation of that is pretty straightforward. Basically, you'll push your momentary switch till you hear the click of the relay, which is about a second. That will connect your auxiliary battery and allow you to start your vehicle using that battery. You can actually confirm it's engaged when you turn the key to the on position and your volt gauge will light up. Both batteries should closely match in voltage, which I know in my case normally they don't. And then you'll be able to start your vehicle up normally and get to safety. Now, what I have found with this particular functionality is that the isolator is going to remain closed until you push it again to disconnect it. So once your vehicle is off, I would make sure to turn that off so that you have isolated your auxiliary battery. And you just push it for a second again, you should hear it click off. And you can confirm that the batteries are of different voltages. It's safe to assume that your isolator is off. You can also check the LED on your isolator. After you turn this off or push it a second time, the indicator should go off as long as the vehicle is off, and your emergency start function will be disengaged. So Kemimoto, thank you for giving us that feature to use in a rather easy way to install. If you're installing this on your vehicle, I would strongly consider getting a momentary switch. Check the description for the switch I used. It's a marine grade switch. It should hold up if you go through water or anything like that. I'm not too worried about the switch failing, and I would definitely recommend taking advantage of that functionality that's built into this isolator. Here again, it's a momentary switch, but it is a toggle function. Once you enable it, you'll want to make sure you turn it off so that your isolator actually turns off when the vehicle is off. So just keep that in mind. So if you've completed the install and everything works, you're in business now. Enjoy your isolator. If you're like me, you're going to love it. You've got an easy way to add aftermarket electric accessories. You've got a whole secondary battery you can use to run these accessories with the vehicle off. The Honda Pioneer doesn't have an accessory position on the key, so it's not ideal to operate those accessories with a key on, having the fuel pump and the computer drawing current from the battery. This gives you a way to run your radio, your lights, etc. as you see fit. You've also got an independent battery for powering things that draw a lot of current, like a winch, and that will isolate those high draw accessories from your main battery. It'll allow you to use those accessories without affecting your main battery or the operation of your vehicle. If you're having any sort of problems with your installation, my advice would be, first and foremost, check your grounds. If your gauge works, the volt gauge is completely independent of your isolator. So if your volt gauge is working, there's probably no issue there. As long as you're seeing a reading on the top and the bottom of your voltmeter, you've probably hooked things up there correctly. Obviously, if you have an issue there, you'll need to investigate. I would begin by checking grounds and retracing your steps, making sure the relay is plugged in properly, making sure all your connections are secure. If for some reason your isolator is not working, you have the vehicle running, you've got no LED light, and you see on your volt gauge your main battery is charging, but your auxiliary battery is in the 12 range. There's a significant difference. between those two voltages, that means for some reason your isolator is not closing. It's not being connected to the Pioneer's charging system. So it would be time to check your grounds, make sure you've got a solid ground. I would use a multimeter to make sure you have continuity between your grounds. Check all your ground points, especially if you're using an aftermarket ground bar or a fuse box, that your ground source is actually getting ground, and you can check that. I would recommend checking, your ground to the negative ground or the frame somewhere, and making sure you don't have high resistance or no continuity. That would indicate you've got a ground issue, and you're going to need to figure that out. If all else fails, I would reach out to Kemimoto. They've got a great support department. They stand behind their products, and they should be able to get you sorted out if, in the unlikely event, there is an issue with your isolator. So I want to thank you all for watching this video. Again, thank you Kemimoto for reaching out to me and trusting me with this install. I had fun making this video. I learned a thing or two on the way. I've never done an actual installation like this. I've done a lot of electronic stuff before, but nothing like this. And it was a little bit intimidating going into it, but their instructions were very easy to follow. I also looked at some other videos of people who have tackled this project on their Pioneers. That built my confidence up, and I was able to sail smoothly through this project with very little lost sleep. All right, gang, if you enjoyed this video, I would certainly appreciate you liking and subscribing. Stay tuned for the next video. Who knows what it will be, but it'll be something. And until next time, Matty O is out of here. Yeah, he is.